stream, all the platforms. Okay, now to open up chat. Activate. Activate. All right. All work. Great. Got all the chats work. Perfect. Okay, so today I plan to watch some watch videos about Canada, and then we're going to go into some recent news. And I probably won't be on too long. Well, Easter Friday, you know. I want to go through a couple things. There's 3 new. Always bring up something interesting. Stagflation trap. Why central banks cannot save you this. Let's get a definition of stagflation first. Can you define stagflation for me? Good. Now I gotta make sure the audio is working. Getting my mic.
A family in
and it's getting desktop audio. Okay, perfect. Okay, stagflation is an economic term that describes a rare and challenging situation where stagnation, slow or no economic growth, often with high unemployment, occurs at the same time as high inflation, rapidly rising prices. So we've kind of been in stagnation for a little while now, Canada. At least when you look at it on a per capita basis, a lot of our growth comes from adding new people to the economy rather than actually seeing productivity gain that are here. And this high inflation, from my understanding, inflation was largely under control in Canada, but like the oil prices are gonna, the war in Iran is gonna spike oil prices, and oil prices cause inflation throughout the entire economy. Like, so I could see something like this happening. It just goes into more. Got my description. Good. Okay. Let's listen.
Brampton opens their mortgage renewal letter on a Tuesday night. The new rate is double what they locked in during the pandemic. The monthly payment jumps by $800.
So, from my understanding, in Canada, you lock in a rate for 5 years, and at the end of the 5 years, you've got to essentially redo your mortgage. Although, like, if you get like a 20-year mortgage, then you're getting a 15-year mortgage the next time. But the rate is only good for 5 years. And see if I could find that. Canadian interest rates chart. Let's see. I think any of these will work. But if you could see, about 5 years ago, doesn't show you all the years. A better one. This gives us all the years. Overnight interest rate. Yeah, this one's not modern either. It's come down significantly from there. This one looks. Yeah, this one looks better. Let's see if we can't make that bigger. So the interest rates. Federal Reserve, Bank of Canada overnight rate. So these are the Canadian interest rates. And if you can see 5 years ago, about 2021, right during the pandemic when interest rates, like they were brought really low to stimulate the economy. And interest rates climbed significantly. They've come down, but they are still significantly higher than they were here. So you had people that got in at super low interest rates that are now going to have to refinance at a much higher rate. And so this is going to increase the amount monthly that they have to pay significantly. I'm guessing that's what this is going to be about.
They knew it was coming. They had been told rates would fall before renewal. Rates did not fall. The next
they've fallen, but they have not fallen to where they were. Nor does it look like they're going to. To combat inflation, raise rates. So if this increasing oil prices is going to cause inflation, you will see a rise in the rates. Combat inflation. That is going to make things harder.
Next morning, the gas station down the street has changed its sign again. $1.68 a liter. It was $1.22 6 weeks ago. The tank costs $40 more to fill. That is 4 times a month. $160 gone before the groceries.
Sometimes the AI images, like, you can see that. Okay, look. I mean, it's getting better, but it's still not great.
Groceries are next. The butter's up. The eggs are up. The bread is up. The receipt at the checkout is $1,100 for a family of 4. It was $818 months ago. Nobody in the store looks surprised anymore. They just look tired. Now add the job market. 84,000 positions disappeared in February. The husband works in logistics. The warehouse has been cutting shifts. The wife works part-time at a clinic that just lost its lease. They're not poor. They're not reckless. They did everything the system told them to do. They bought a home. They paid their taxes. They followed the plan. The plan assumed that when things got bad enough, the Bank of Canada would cut rates and the pain would ease. That assumption held for 40 years. In 2008, the central bank cut. In 2020, the central bank cut harder. Both times, the household got relief. This time, the Bank of Canada held rates at 2.25% in March 2026. It did not cut. It cannot cut. Because the thing that is hurting the family, energy prices surging through a closed strait, is the same thing that prevents the central bank from lowering rates without detonating inflation. Cut rates and inflation explodes. Raise rates and the mortgage kills the household.
Let me hear that one.
Detonating inflation. Cut rates and inflation explodes.
Cut rates and inflation explodes. Yeah, we're going to be seeing inflationary pressures right now. You tackle inflationary pressures by raising rates. Cut them, you're going to trigger more inflation.
Raise rates and the mortgage kills the house.
Raise rates and the mortgage kills the household. That's the whole, if you raise rates, people have to renew their mortgage at a new rate. I'm gonna double check that. In Canadian housing, you have to renew your rate every 5 years, correct? That'll figure.
Household. Do nothing, and both pressures grind the family from opposite directions at the same time. In the Hormuz trap, we showed you why Canada cannot survive an oil shock. This video shows you why nobody is coming to rescue you from it. You cannot print a barrel of oil. This is the stagflation trap. To understand the paralysis, you must understand the two diseases central banks were built to cure. A recession is a collapse in demand. People stop spending, companies stop hiring, credit tightens, output falls. The central bank response is straightforward. Lower rates, make money cheaper, pull demand forward, restart the machine. Inflation is the opposite disease. Demand runs too hot, money is too easy, prices climb faster than wages. The response is also straightforward. Raise rates, make money expensive, slow borrowing, break momentum. Those are separate illnesses with separate medicines. For 40 years, every crisis was one or the other. The central bank picked the correct button and pressed it. The system recovered. The public was told the machine still worked. Stagflation is what happens when both diseases arrive in the same body at the same time.
That's going to be hard to fix. Let's have a look here. No, it's not strictly required to renew every 5 years in Canada, housing, mortgages. But 5-year terms are by far the most common, so many homeowners do renew on that schedule. Key distinction in Canadian mortgages, mortgage term. This is the length of your current contract with the lender. 1, 2, 3, 5, or occasionally longer, like 7 to 10. It determines how long your interest rate and often other conditions is locked in. Amortization period. This is the total time to fully pay off the mortgage, typically 25 or 30 years. It is much longer than the term. At the end of each term, you must either renew with the same lender or switch lenders via renewal/transfer. Oh, so you could switch, refinance, or pay off the balance in full. You don't start over on the full amortization. Yeah. Simply continue with the remaining time left. After 5 years on 25-year amortization, you have 20 years remaining. Why 5 years is the standard? 5-year fixed mortgage rate, common choice in Canada. It offers a balance between rate stability and flexibility. Typical 25-year amortization might consist of 5 consecutive 5-year terms, meaning you'd renew roughly every 5 years until paid off. Short terms or variable rate mortgages exist, but 5 years fixed is dominant for predictability. So most of them are 5-year. Connection to stagflation. Oh, I like how it does that. In a stagflation-like environment, high inflation plus weak growth, new every 5 years can be painful if rates spike due to inflation fighting measures by the Bank of Canada. I mean, we've seen rates spike. Well, it's not really that rates spiked, it's that they were massively lower during COVID. So people got their houses, got their bills and everything during the COVID low interest rate. Built their life around that payment. And now that payment is likely going to go way up. Many homeowners who locked in low rates pre-2022, faced renewal shock in 2025 and 2026, so this year, as they move to higher prevailing rates. If you're in Alberta or anywhere in Canada, shopping around at renewal time is smart. Often switch lenders without much hassle to get better rates. Okay.
Growth weakens, hiring weakens, output slows. But prices still rise because the pressure is not coming from booming demand. It is coming from the supply side. Energy costs rise, inputs vanish, shipping routes harden, food and transport costs move through everything else. Every intervention that helps one disease makes the other worse. Cut rates to stop the slump, and you pour fuel into prices already rising for physical reasons. Raise rates to stop inflation, and you drive a weak economy deeper into weakness. The central bank does not lack competence. It lacks a third button. The last major version of this story ran through the 1970s. Oil shocks hit an already fragile system. Consumer inflation in the United States reached 14.8% in March 1980. Unemployment later hit 10.8% in late 1982. 3 separate recessions hit between 1973 and 1982. An entire generation learned what it meant when the economic engine seized and the usual medicine stopped working. The medicine for one disease accelerates the other. That is the definition of the trap. Paul Volcker took office at the Federal Reserve in 1979 and chose force. The federal funds rate was pushed near 20%. Prime rates touched 21.5%. This was not fine-tuning. This was blunt force monetary surgery. It was not gentle. Farmers drove tractors to the Federal Reserve headquarters in protest. Car dealers mailed Volcker coffins containing the keys to unsold vehicles. Businesses failed. Credit cracked. Unemployment climbed above 10%. Then the inflation regime ended. A long era of disinflation, financial expansion, and falling rates began. The pain purchased a 20-year golden age. The weapon worked. But there is one detail that matters more than the rate itself. The United States entered that war with federal debt at roughly 31% of GDP. That is what made the weapon usable. The borrower standing behind the currency was light enough to survive the treatment. The body was smaller, the leverage was lower, the public balance sheet had room to bleed. That debt level no longer exists. On March 17th, 2026, United States gross national debt crossed $39 trillion. Debt to GDP now sits at roughly 122%, 4 times the level that existed when Volcker fired his weapon. The federal government already pays more than $1 trillion per year in interest on that debt. The Congressional Budget Office projects interest payments will rise to $2.1 trillion per year by 2036. Over the next decade, the United States will spend $16.2 trillion doing nothing but servicing past borrowing. Not building, not investing, not defending, just paying interest on money already spent. Run the math.
The debt is one of those things that I think is going to be a pretty big problem. I think it was like the International Monetary Fund said anything above 70%, so your debt above 70% of GDP will start to significantly hamper growth in your country. What is Canada's debt to GDP ratio? And what is the US's? I could probably get this on a graph, actually. Doesn't tell me. I can hover, not Canada. Canada, 110%. Oh, that's high. That's really high. We're below the US, but still, most of Europe has a pretty high debt to GDP ratio. I mean, Sweden and Norway, country, doing much better. Oh, that's scary.
Put a 10% average rate on $39 trillion of debt. That is 3.9.
And isn't our current government expanding the debt? How much is Mark Carney expanding the Canadian debt by? This one. Okay, Mark Carney became Prime Minister of Canada in March 2025 after leadership. Key figures on budget slash deficit expansion. 2025-2026 fiscal year deficit projected at 78 billion. This is more than double the deficit forecast in the previous Liberal government fall economic statement. It's the largest non-pandemic deficit in Canadian history. So, one deficit, like, I always dislike a deficit. The whole idea is that during hard times, you run a deficit to support the economy during good times, surplus to get the deficit down so that you can do it again next hard times show up. We are facing like trade restrictions from the US, but the level of deficit right now is just completely unsustainable for really any kind of length. Cumulative deficit approximately 321.7 billion, which is more than double the projected by the Trudeau government for a similar period. So he's outspending Trudeau. Trudeau, the big spender. Okay, total federal debt projections, gross debt expected to reach 2.5 trillion. 2025 historical high. Yeah, like this is the one of the big things that I wasn't fond of Mark Carney is his deficit spend. Like I like surplus. It's like in the end, you always gotta pay your debts.
$9 trillion in annual interest. Put 15%, and it approaches $5.85 trillion. The weapon that killed inflation in 1980 would now bankrupt the government that fires it. And this is not American alone. Global debt hit $348 trillion at the end of 2025. Government debt alone was more than $106 trillion. Non-financial corporate debt was over $100 trillion. Household debt was over $64 trillion. Emerging markets face more than $9 trillion in debt redemptions in 2026 alone. The OECD reports that governments and corporations worldwide will borrow $29 trillion from bond markets this year, double the level of a decade ago. Japan carries debt at 230% of GDP. France, the United
230%? Like, that's wild. What was Greece's level of debt when it collapsed? What was Greece's debt to GDP ratio when they experienced collapse? Collapse, bankruptcy? Eh. Greece's sovereign debt crisis erupted in late 2009. Okay, debt to GDP ratio. Greece's public debt to GDP ratio 2009 was revised to 127%. So if we're at 110 right now, at 127, we've seen a modern economy have a sovereign debt crisis. And they're doing significantly more spending. Now, Greece is definitely in a very different situation. Canada, they use the euro. They don't have control of their own currency. That gives you a lot more leeway. Still, like, what was it? Japan's at 270 now? Why are they running up the score? I don't get it.
dollars from bond markets this year, double the level of a decade ago. Japan carries debt at 230% of GDP. France and the United Kingdom are both above 100% and climbing. Every major economy on Earth is leveraged beyond the point where Volcker-style intervention remains an option. In the 1980s, they played on solid ground. Now they play on quicksand. We saw one side of this in the rate cut mirage. We saw the housing credit machinery behind it in the mortgage bond trap. Cheap money was never just rescue. It became architecture. The system used low rates to build a civilization of leverage. Volcker's weapon now bankrupts the shooter. Tell me in the comments whether you still believe central banks can always rescue markets by cutting rates.
Inflation.
Not all inflation is the same, and this distinction destroys the entire toolkit. If households get reckless, credit gets loose, and demand runs hotter than supply, central banks know what to do. Raise rates, slow spending, break demand. That worked in 2022 and 2023. That is demand inflation. Supply shock inflation is a different disease. The problem is not too much money. The problem is that the goods are physically missing. You cannot print a barrel of oil. You cannot set an interest rate that unseals the Strait of Hormuz. You cannot quantitatively ease 20 million barrels a day of crude back onto tankers anchored in the Gulf of Oman because the insurance market will not cover them. Since March 2nd, 2026, tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has collapsed by more than 90%. Iran has attacked at least 21 merchant vessels. More than 150 tankers sit stranded. Qatar, one of the world's largest LNG exporters, halted production after drone attacks on its Ras Laffan terminal. 20% of global oil and 20% of global LNG removed from the market. The International Energy Agency called it the most significant supply shock in the history of the oil market. Central banks cannot treat supply inflation. Rate hikes do not create oil. Rate cuts do not unseal shipping lanes. The toolkit has a proven cure for one type of inflation. The type currently hitting the global economy is the other one. When the shortage is physical, money becomes a witness, not a cure. As of late March, Brent crude was trading around $111. Before the recent escalation, it was roughly $75. A 50% move in a month. That is not noise. That is the price of a choke point entering the bloodstream. The Dallas Fed modeled closure scenarios. In the short case, 3 months, oil jumps to $98 and global growth takes an immediate hit of 2.9 percentage points annualized in the second quarter. In the 6-month case, oil pushes to 115 in the third quarter and 76 in the fourth. In the 9-month case, $132 by year end, and the growth damage deepens to negative 1.3 percentage points through the fourth quarter. And even the official simulation admits it only models oil. It leaves out natural gas, fertilizer, tanker market dislocation, insurance costs, and expectation effects. The bypass routes cannot save the system. The Saudi east-west pipeline carries only 3.5 million barrels per day.
This was a little while ago, right? 6 days. Are oil tankers passing through the Strait of Hormuz now? If so, at what percent of normal volume is it? Because I heard, I think on the news somewhere, that certain oil tankers were getting through. So let's see. Yes, oil tankers are still passing through the Strait of Hormuz as of April 2026, but traffic is severely restricted due to ongoing Iran. Okay, current traffic levels roughly 100 to 138 vessels per day, including tankers, oil and gas tankers, large. Normal pre-conflict baseline. Okay, so before the conflict, 100 to 138 vessels per day. Recent actual traffic. Daily transits have dropped dramatically, often to 5 to 6 vessels per day. Sometimes as low as 0 to 7 on certain days, with many under dark AIS off or rerouted conditions near Iranian islands. Okay, so there's still basically no traffic. 100 to 5. That is a huge disruption still going on.
That leaves a shortfall of more than 16 million barrels per day with no alternative routing. Tell me in the comments, what is rising first where you live? Fuel, groceries, rent, or all three?
I personally see it in fuel. But
The International Energy Agency announced the largest emergency release in its 50-year history, 400 million barrels from 32 countries. The United States alone committed 172 million barrels from its strategic petroleum reserve. That sounds large until you do the arithmetic. At 20 million barrels per day moving through Hormuz, 400 million barrels buys roughly 20 days. The United States Reserve was already sitting at 60% of capacity before the release. After the drawdown, it falls to levels not seen since the early 1980s. The last major drawdown after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 has still not been fully replaced 4 years later. Strategic reserves buy time. They do not buy supply. And beneath the immediate crisis lies a structural one that has been building for a decade. The world needs approximately $1 trillion per year in upstream oil and gas investment to maintain production capacity. Actual spending sits around $600 to $700 billion, an annual deficit of $300 to $400 billion, compounding year after year. Banks withdrew funding from fossil fuel projects under ESG pressure. Insurance companies pulled coverage. Regulatory uncertainty froze planning horizons.
ESG pressure? ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. The framework used to measure a company's sustainability, ethical impact, and risk management financial performance. Okay. So they face pressure from environmental, social, and governments for less oil investment. I mean, not in the US. Trump was the whole drill baby drill.
Shareholders demanded capital discipline over exploration. The industry got leaner. It also got far more fragile. Global production declines 5 to 6% annually from natural field exhaustion. That means 5 to 6 million barrels per day must be replaced every year just to stay even. The underinvestment was invisible when markets were calm. Now that a physical shock has arrived, there is no spare capacity to absorb it. The wells that were never drilled cannot produce oil today. The buffer is gone. It took a decade to dismantle. It will take a decade to rebuild. Every central bank on earth faces some version of this trap. The Federal Reserve held rates at 3.5%. The European Central Bank held at 2%. Markets that expected rate cuts this year are now pricing rate hikes, but the Bank of Canada sits in the deepest version of the trap, and the weight it carries is uniquely Canadian. The Canadian household carries the highest debt-to-income ratio in the developed world. The overnight rate is 2.25%, held for the third consecutive meeting. The economy contracted 0.6% in the fourth quarter. 84,000 jobs were lost in February. Unemployment has risen to 6.7%. That picture screams for rate cuts. The economy needs oxygen. But the Bank of Canada acknowledged in its March statement that inflation risks have increased due to higher energy prices, even as growth risks tilt to the downside. Markets have started pricing 75 basis points of rate hikes by year end. TD Economics.
75 points? What? Are they expecting rate hikes in Canada before year's end? See what it comes up like. That's a lot. Okay. No, rate hikes are not the base case expectation for the Bank of Canada for the end of 2026, but they are now a plausible risk, particularly in the second half of the year, due to upside inflation pressure from the ongoing Strait of Hormuz disruption and higher global oil prices. Current situation. The BOC's key overnight policy rate stands at 2.25%, where it has been held steady since late 2025. The headline inflation was low at 1.8. So usually most governments aim for like a 2% inflation target year over year. So they're currently below 2. The issue is that when you're above 2%, that inflation is still there. Because we had significant inflation for a couple years, like significantly above 2%, which is why they kept changing the rate. But all that inflationary, that's just become part of society. Can't, like, they're not going to try and undercut it to offset the over 2% that we've had for so long. Canada inflation chart by year. Inflation rate falls. Goes up to like 2025, November 24. So here we had the pandemic, and the pandemic it's always been a weird thing, right? And that actually dropped inflation for a little bit. That I think is because they massively lowered interest rates, stimulate the economy, that dropped inflation, and then it spiked up to 8% at one point. And this is all inflation that the market has now absorbed. And we've brought it back down. That is all still there in the form of higher prices that you pay on everything.
Said publicly that a rate hike is not off the table for 2026. If the Bank of Canada cuts to protect growth,
not guaranteed, but not off the table.
It risks feeding inflation coming through supply. If it hikes to defend inflation credibility, it hits an economy already losing jobs and a housing system walking into renewal shock. The bank's own research says about 60% of outstanding mortgages renew in 2025 or 2026. About 60% of those borrowers face higher payments. Some 5-year fixed borrowers face average payment increases around 20%. Some variable rate borrowers face jumps above 40%. Another million households are renewing this year.
Anyways, telling us what we're...
Average payment increases around 20%. So for 2026, it hits an economy already losing jobs and a housing system walking into renewal shock. The bank's own research says about 60% of outstanding mortgages renew in 2025 or
60% of outstanding mortgages renewed last year or this year.
2026. About 60% of those borrowers face higher payments.
60% of them are facing higher
Some
payment.
5-year fixed borrowers face average payment increases around 20%.
The 5-year, which is most of them, face an average increase of about 20%. So the thing that they've budgeted around, probably their biggest expense, about to get 20% larger, while inflation pressures are about to pick up.
Some variable rate borrowers face jumps above 40%. Another million households are renewing this year. The family in Brampton from the cold open is not a hypothetical. They are the median case. Higher energy costs from below. Higher debt service costs from above. Same paycheck, less room. No institutional rescue on the horizon. This is where the payroll collapse meets the mortgage. Bond trap meets the Hormuz trap. Labor weakness, debt rollover, and a supply shock arriving in the same quarter. 3 structural crises converging on the same kitchen table. Nobody's coming to rescue the mortgage.
The verdict?
For 40 years, the public lived inside a rhythm. When growth broke, rates fell. When markets panicked, liquidity arrived. When debt expanded, refinancing stayed available. That rhythm created a civilization built on the assumption of rescue. In financial markets, that assumption has a name: the Fed put. The unspoken guarantee that central banks will always catch the falling knife. That guarantee is breaking, not because central bankers lack the will, because the crisis is physical, not financial. In 2008, the crisis was financial. Banks held toxic assets. The Fed bought those assets and stabilized the system. In 2020, the crisis was temporary. Lockdowns ended. Demand returned. The printed money had somewhere to go. In 2026, the crisis is physical. Energy is missing from the global system. And the structural underinvestment that starved the oil industry of capital for a decade means there is no rapid supply response waiting in the wings.
So there's been massive underinvestment in oil energy. Let me check that. In recent years, has there been an underinvestment into oil? Yes, there has been widespread agreement among analysts, the IEA and OPEC and industry observers that the global oil and gas sector experienced significant underinvestment in upstream exploration and production activities in recent years, particularly from the mid 2010s through 2025. So the last 10 years. Like, as a society, I think moving to renewables is something that we have to do. Oil is a limited resource. Can't function a society on it long term. It'll either run out or something's gonna happen. But how dependent our society currently is on it, like it's gonna take time to transition. We're gonna need some kind of breakthrough, probably in energy storage, before we can hope to really get off oil. Like we're seeing investment into that area right now, but it's not here yet. So underinvesting into oil is gonna cause some pain. Key evidence of underinvestment. Capital. Okay, I don't need to go to the nitty gritty. Or like a summary. Ooh, relevance to Canada / Alberta and broader economy. As an oil exporting province, Alberta, higher global prices from supply risks like the current Hormuz issues can benefit producers, but chronic underinvestment elsewhere contributes to price volatility, which feeds to Canadian inflation, interest rates, and your mortgage renewal environment we discussed earlier. Canada itself has seen disciplined, not always expansive, investment in oil sands and other plays, partly due to regulatory or pipeline constraints. Okay. So there hasn't been an expansion. This underinvestment dynamic ties into the stagflation risks we've covered. Supply shocks, energy disruption can drive inflation even as growth reaches elsewhere. Okay, get to the end.
The inflation pressure comes through energy and supply, not excess demand. The debt stack is too large for Volcker-style medicine. The central bank still has buttons. The buttons no longer restore order without breaking something else first. For a generation, the implicit promise was simple. Take on the mortgage, take on the car loan, take on the line of credit. If things go wrong, rates will fall, your payments will shrink, and the system will catch you. That promise shaped how people bought homes, planned retirements, and calculated risk. It became the invisible floor under every financial decision made by a middle-class household since the 1990s. The floor is cracking, not because someone chose to remove it, because the physics of a supply shock and the mathematics of a debt wall have combined to make the floor structurally unsound. The backstop was never law, it was belief, and belief is now meeting arithmetic. That is the stagflation trap. The medicine cabinet is empty. Drop a like so more households see it. Subscribe for the economic truths nobody else will say out loud. Tell me in the comments, what is your plan if rates go up and energy costs do not come down? I am Hawk, and I will see you in the next one.
So I'll link the video. Should be able to do that through. No, stop progressing. Should do it in all 3 places. Perfect. All right, so the what's happening in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz very likely going to cause inflationary pressure. And even once the war ends, you're probably going to see inflationary pressure for a good deal of time afterwards. To combat this, usually what you would want to do is raise your rates, combat inflation. But people are seeing 20% increase on their mortgage payments when they go through for a renewal. Some, he was saying, even are seeing like up to a 40%. That can put a lot of people in water. That's gonna stress Canadian households. How do you keep inflation in line without causing that kind of a pain to the household? That's a problem I don't know if we have an answer for. Yeah, we're gonna have to see. Let's see if AI can solve our problems. If what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz is going to cause inflationary pressure, but the mortgage issue is causing, how do I say this? Cause inflationary pressure. But the rise in interest rates is causing pressure on families. How do you fix the inflationary pressure without causing more stress on the family budget? Uh, is there like a deep think here? Auto fast expert. Let it think about that one. All right, this one's recent, so I'm gonna leave that one to watch another day. This one.
There's a model.
Once we finish reading about, oh, I should just. How do you fix stagflation? Oh my God, such an easier way to ask the question. Let's see what it comes up with though. Yes, this is the classic stagflation dilemma. We've been discussing a supply shock from the Strait of Hormuz. The Iran-related disruption cutting oil tanker traffic to a trickle, pushes up energy prices and broader inflation. Well, higher interest rates, or even the threat of them, hammer family budgets through mortgage renewals, higher borrowing costs, and slower economic growth. The good news is that central banks like the Canadian Bank don't have to rely solely on rate hikes for this kind of inflation. Rate hikes are a blunt tool best suited for demand-driven inflation. For oil-driven supply shocks, they can actually make the family stress part worse without fixing the root cause. Here are the main realistic ways policymakers can ease inflationary pressure without or with minimal rate further rate increase. Targeted fiscal relief, direct help for households, energy rebates or gas tax holidays, temporary cuts to federal/provincial fuel taxes or one-time checks, like the old GST check top up or Alberta's carbon tax rebate, can offset the pump price without stimulating the whole economy. Income tested support, focused aid on lower and middle income families, expanded Canada Child benefits or targeted hydro/heat rebate, so it doesn't add broad inflationary fuel. This is what many countries did in 2022, 2023 during the last energy spike. Cushion budgets faster than waiting for rates to work through the system. Boost domestic slash alternative supply, fix the shortage itself. Strategic petroleum reserve release, we've seen that to bridge the gap while Hormuz traffic normalizes. Accelerate Canada's oil slash gas production. That's what we've seen such an underinvestment in. Faster approvals for pipelines, LNG terminals, or oil sands expansion in Alberta. Canada is a net exporter, ramping up non-OPEC plus supply directly counters the global tightness caused by years of underinvestment we talked about. Diversifying energy, speed up nuclear refurbishment, small modular reactors or renewable where they're cost effective. Anything that reduces long-term dependency on Middle East oil. Okay. Fiscal discipline on the spending side. The Carney government's large new deficit adds demand side pressure on top of the oil shock. Reining in non-essential spending helps keep inflation expectations anchored without needing the BOC to hike rates, the Bank of Canada. So they're creating demand side pressure on top of the oil shock, which is the oil shock is a supply side decrease. They're creating a demand side pressure increase. This is the opposite of the 1970s mistake when governments kept spending while central banks tried to fight oil-driven inflation alone. But wait, is that a good thing? I don't know. Monetary policy that recognizes the shock, hold or pause rate hikes. Okay, the Bank of Canada has explicitly said it's watching the Middle East closely, can be flexible. If the inflation is clearly transitory slash supply driven, growth is weak, they can look through it. A lesson learned from past oil shocks. Forward guidance and credibility. Okay, long term structural fixes. Yeah. Address the underinvestment in oil. Realistic trade offs. No free lunch. Pure monetary tightening, rate hikes, is the fastest way to crush inflation expectation, but it hits mortgage renewals hardest in Canada's 5-year term system. Exactly the pain you're worried about. The fiscal slash supply side options above are slower and can add to debt if not offset by cuts elsewhere, but they protect families more directly. Historic precedent. In the 1970s oil shocks, countries that combined supply side boosts plus targeted relief, example US under Reagan later, fared better than those that just hiked rates aggressively while spending. In short, the least painful path for Canadian families right now is a mix of targeted rebates plus aggressive supply side action, both domestic oil and diplomatic. While the Bank of Canada stays patient on rates unless core inflation starts spiraling, that's how you attack the source of the inflation, the oil shock, instead of just squeezing demand and household budgets. If the Hormuz situation de-escalates soon, ceasefire talks are ongoing, a lot of this pressure evaporates on its own. Want me to walk through what this would look like for a typical, no, there. Short, the least painful path for Canadian families right now is a mixed targeted rebates plus aggressive supply side action. So, supply side action is investment into oil, right? Increasing your supply. Diplomatic, I mean, if the Strait of Hormuz is making oil hard to get all around the world, I don't know how diplomatic is going to. So the Bank of Canada is patient on rate unless core inflation starts spiraling. Haven't seen any rate hikes yet. No, must not be spiraling. But the only true way to counter this, in my opinion, is aggressive supply side action. Need to fix the underinvestment into oil. As much as we got to get away from it eventually, because of what it does to the economy, what it does to the environment, how it's is a limited resource. Right now, I think there needs to be a significant investment to oil and gas in Canada. Like we just seen it in the US, right? Trump's whole drill baby drill was, he had some idea, was pushing for that. Is Mark Carney investing more into oil? Let's see what the current government's. We're talking about this for an hour. I watch a 10-minute video and I talk for an hour. Oh, okay. But it's definitely like this is something a lot of Canadians are about to feel. Yes, Mark Carney's government is actively supporting more investment in Canada's oil and gas sector, especially oil sands and LNG, liquefied natural gas, compared to the later Trudeau years. Though it's mostly through regulatory easing, tax incentives, and fast tracking private projects rather than massive new direct federal spending. Okay, so they see the problem and they are working to address it. Key policy shifts: scrap the oil and gas emission cap, Canada's Alberta MOU, sign deals with Alberta's premier for a new private sector oil pipeline to BC. That's something we needed 10 years ago. I guess better late than never. Uh, Major projects, office fast tracking multiple oil/LNG related projects, including liquefied natural gas facilities and the pathway CCS networks for oil sands, have been designated national interest projects. This cuts red tapes and unlocks billion in private capital. The first two trenches alone represent over 116 billion in total investment across energy. Like, that's good. All right, so they are moving on this. Addressing global oil underinvestment by removing barriers, the government is trying to encourage the private sector capex that has been lagging for a decade. Exactly the supply side fix we talked about for reducing inflationary pressures from the Strait of Hormuz disruption. No big new taxpayer funded oil wells. The 280 billion Curel, approximately 450 billion cash budget 2025 generational investment leaning more towards infrastructure, defense, housing, and energy. Nuclear, hydro, grid. Nuclear and hydro are nice. Canada doesn't have the same solar capacity as a lot of the world just because of our altitude. We've also investing a lot into wind power. But honestly, I like nuclear and hydro more. But the enable policies above are explicitly meant to unlock hundreds of billions in private oil slash gas investment over 5 years. Trade off for families. Boosting Canadian oil supply helps moderate global price spikes. Good for inflation and your gas slash heating bills, while avoiding the need for aggressive Bank of Canada rate hikes that hammer mortgage renewal. Critics argue it delays climate goals and locks in more fossil. I mean, climate goals are good when your economy is strong. I think we're facing a weaker economy. The investment in oil and gas I like. Even the investment in clean energy, nuclear and hydro. Like, I've seen in the US, data centers take a huge amount of power. That fuels the whole AI revolution, right? I think in the coming future, there's only going to be more and more demand for power. So investing in nuclear, hydro, even oil and gas, I think these are all good things right now. Even though eventually we will have to tone back oil and gas. I think that's probably quite a ways off still. Okay, in short, yes, more than late what Trudeau policy. The focus is pragmatic economic security and diversification amid US tariffs and Middle East chaos, not a full return to unchecked oil expansion. Oil companies in Alberta are largely supportive. Environmental advocates are not. I mean, I'm supportive. If you want the exam, no. All right. They appear to be moving in the correct direction. This is good. I don't like how big the deficit is. Let's move on to another topic. Okay. I can cut this now. Timestamp. So that's the cut one. Cut thing between topics, and that's going to make it a lot easier to edit. All right. Okay. The 49% line. The recession model that has never been wrong. Okay, let's have a look at this.
Model. It runs quietly in the background while markets.
I have no sound.
There is a model. It runs quietly in the background while markets talk about soft landings, while politicians talk about resilience, while households keep making payments on the assumption that next quarter will look enough like the last one to stay alive. The model does not care about narratives. It reads labor data, consumer spending, manufacturing orders, credit conditions, financial stress, energy prices. It takes the noise of the economy and compresses it into one number, one probability, one line on a scale that says whether the United States is heading toward recession in the next 12 months. It is maintained by Moody's Analytics, and it has one property that
Is this going to be GDP growth? Guessing?
makes it dangerous. Every single time that number has crossed 50%, a recession followed. Not most of the time, not usually, every time.
Was that
Across 11
GDP growth? That number is nowhere near 50%.
American recessions since the Second World War. 80 years of history, zero misses. In February 2026, the model reached 49%, 1 point below the line that has
I mean, what is this
never
number?
been wrong. And that reading was taken before the latest deterioration fully entered the machine, before the newest energy shock moved through the full data cycle. before the March consumer panic was properly absorbed, before the next employment print.
I mean, like, I think Canada's been in a technical recession for a while. GDP per capita chart. Okay, what am I looking for? GDP per capita chart. Gross domestic per capita returns to trend scenario. Yeah, I think this is really old though. Like that's 20 stops at like 2023. Do we have one that goes further? 10 years. Maybe this one will work. Um, let's try AI. I'm not finding the data I'm looking for. For the last 4 years, can you break down the GDP growth per capita in Canada by quarter? We're not going to get to see our nice little chart, but this should get us what we're looking for. I don't thinking mode. Let's keep going.
Before the oil spike began bleeding into confidence, freight, food, and spending at the same time. The number is already at 49. The inputs are getting worse. And if you are a household in Brampton, Calgary, Windsor, or Halifax, that number is not an American curiosity. It is a countdown attached to your mortgage renewal, your job security, your grocery bill, and the next policy decision from a Bank of Canada that is already trapped between inflation from outside and weakness from inside. In the Hormuz trap, we showed you why Canada cannot survive the next oil shock. In the stagflation trap, we showed you why central banks cannot rescue you from it. This video is the missing third layer. This is the model that is about to call the timing. The line is at...
Okay, I'm gonna wait to hear what the actual number is about after. Oh, it is really thinking. Okay.
At 49, the next print absorbs the damage, and the model has never been wrong. This is the 49% line. The power of the number comes from what it is not. It is not a headline. It is not a pundit's mood. It is not a television panel guessing whether the vibes feel recessionary. It is a pattern recognition system built to identify the combinations of weakness that have preceded every modern American downturn. It takes a wide spread of leading indicators and asks one question: does the current structure of the economy resemble
A wide spread of leading indicators? No idea what those are.
the structure that existed before prior recessions? When the answer is no, the number stays low. When the answer starts drifting toward yes, the number rises. And when it crosses 50, the historical record says the recession clock has already started. That matters because ordinary...
I think we might be inside the recession clock. Quarterly real GDP per capita growth percentage, Q over Q. So what's the rule? Like 2 quarters in the negative is a technical recession, or is it 2 years in the... Okay, so nothing, 0.5, negative 0.3, plus 0.3, plus 0.1, minus 0.1, not explicitly published. Okay. 2023, we were in a recession. We had one positive 0.1 that broke it up in 2022 and 2023. This persistent weakness in per capita growth has been a key driver of the feel bad economy. Higher housing costs, mortgage renewal pressures, and stagflation risks. Strong population growth masks underlying softness until 2025, when slower immigration helped per capita numbers stabilize, even as the Strait of Hormuz oil shock and Carney era deficit landed new inflationary pressures. Levels. Okay, what is the criteria for a technical recession? Like, in my opinion, this looks very recessionary. We don't have the numbers. Actually, I guess this goes right up to 2025, the end of 2025. We did have Q3. I mean, that looks good, but everything else, 0.3 isn't. Let's see, what's the a technical recession is the common rule of thumb definition used by economists, media, and analysts worldwide. 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth. So real GDP in our Canadian economy has been masked by immigration. Strong population growth masks underlying softness. So if we look at the GDP per capita and we apply that to the 2 consecutive quarters, then we were in a recession here. We were in a recession here. We briefly left the recession. These ones aren't even, we have no idea that that recession continued throughout that whole period or not. And a couple, I mean, I wouldn't even call those strong quarters. It's not negative. And a negative and a positive and right at zero. Like, we've been in and out of a recession, technically. We look at the real GDP per capita, like the past 5 years in Canada. This is the past 3 years. I kind of want to go further back to see what. Let's get back to it.
Economic commentary
Hear what the actual indicator is.
usually fails in the same way. It gets trapped arguing about one data point at a time. One jobs report, one inflation print, one GDP revision, one oil spike, one market sell-off. That is how people miss the whole picture. They wait for certainty in one indicator while the system is already weakening across 6 others. The model does not make that mistake. It is designed to read deterioration as a cluster. Weak labor, weak confidence, weak output, tightening credit, energy stress, asset repricing. One by one, none of those conditions has to mean recession. Together, they create the fingerprint. That is why the line matters. Not because machine learning is magic, because pattern recognition is exactly what recessions hide behind until they are too obvious to deny. And this is where the channel logic gets strong.
They don't tell you you're in a recession when you're in a recession. It's something that history remembers later on. They try to mask it when you're in a recession because they don't want people freaking out.
The Hormuz trap gave you the physical shock. The stagflation trap gave you the policy paralysis. This file gives you the signal that tells you when the macro damage is becoming too large to contain with narrative management. The model is not predicting the trigger. The trigger is already visible. The model is measuring whether the body can survive it. The answer is getting closer to no. The model does not predict the panic. It measures the fragility. Tell me in the comments.
What is the model?
Do you trust a model with an 80-year record, or do you think this cycle is somehow the first exception?
The inputs. Okay.
The line did not rise to 49 because of one bad month. It got there because almost every important input has started moving in the wrong direction at the same time. Start with labor. The United States lost 92,000 jobs in February. Outside the narrow areas still absorbing workers, the labor
I mean, Canada's losing jobs like crazy too. I think a lot of this was the low interest rates into COVID caused the spike in employment because money was cheap. That's the rebound that we see in the economy. And now there is like now they're the jobs that they didn't need they have hired, there's a correction. So we're losing the jobs, turn to a more stable economy. Only after we lose these jobs are we going to see the damage that was truly done by COVID. And I think it's going to be significant. I think the cheap, low interest rates, cheap money hid the damage. And now that the damage is going to be shown, companies no longer is their cheap money have to correct their workforce. It's brutal. From what I understand, nowhere's hiring right now. It's incredibly tough to get a job. We can't do the same thing we did where we super lower interest rate because of the inflation spike that causes. I don't know.
market has been losing momentum for months. This is how downturns usually begin, not with one spectacular collapse. With quiet exhaustion, less hiring, fewer openings, more caution, payrolls that stop expanding fast enough to absorb new weakness.
I've heard that hiring is down across Canada and the US. What can you tell me about this? We got thinking mode on, so let's
Then
continue.
comes confidence, less hiring, fewer openings, more caution, payrolls that stop expanding fast enough to absorb new weakness. Then comes confidence. Consumer sentiment is not a luxury statistic. It is the emotional balance sheet of the household sector. When that index collapses, it tells you something vital. People do not just feel pessimistic. They start changing behavior. They delay purchases. They hold cash. They cancel plans.
You want your consumers to continue consuming because consumers losing confidence is what can start a downward spiral in an economy.
Stop assuming the future will be easier than the present. That mood change feeds directly into spending, and spending is the engine under the American economy. Then comes output. GDP growth slowed sharply, not to collapse levels, but to the kind of level that matters in the late stage of a cycle, weak enough that any external shock hits harder, weak enough that the economy enters the next stress event with no cushion, weak enough that a supply shock is no longer striking a healthy body. It is striking one that was already tired. Then comes oil.
Okay, let's oh my gosh, it talked a lot. Yes, hiring has slowed noticeably in both Canada and the US over the past year. Recent data showing outright weakness in early 2026. This fits the broader picture of soft economic momentum, trade tensions, US tariffs, slower population growth in Canada, which in our population growth was mainly immigration, which we are cutting back. Global uncertainty, including the Strait of Hormuz. That's making employers cautious. Canada's net losses and a static labor market. Statistic Canada's labor force survey shows the labor market has stalled. February 2026, employment fell by, oh, we heard about this, 84,000 jobs. Minus 0.4%. So 1 month, we lost 0.4% of jobs. The largest monthly drop outside the pandemic since early 2022. This followed a 25,000 job decline in January. Full-time jobs were hit hardest. Year over year, employment is essentially flat, almost no job growth over the last 12 months. Unemployment rose to 6.7% in February, up from 6.5% in January. Hiring activity, the Canadian Hiring Index tracking online job posting, fell for the fourth straight month in February. Job vacancies have been trending lower overall. Sectors, losses concentrated in wholesale/retail trade, construction, manufacturing, information/culture/recreation, and other services. Some offset in transportation/warehousing, public administration, not enough to reverse the trend. Broader context, economists describe the market as static after a year of U.S. tariffs and a sharp slowdown in population growth, which had previously masked weakness. TD Economics expects the labor market to tread water 2026. Wage growth has also eased. In Alberta specifically, the tourism mix, energy sector hiring could see some lift from higher global oil prices tied to the Hormuz disruption, and Canada's push for more oil investment under Carney. National trade and manufacturing softness still weigh on overall hiring. Okay, United States hiring at post-pandemic lows. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, JOLTS, reports February 2026 data, released March 31st, firms cooling demand. Job openings, little change at 6.9 million. Hires dropped sharply to 4.85 million, the lowest level since March 2020. The higher rates fell to 3.1%, also the lowest since April 2020. Layoffs remain low, ticked up slightly. Trend, employers are posting fewer new openings, actually filling far fewer positions, reflecting caution amid trade uncertainty, slower growth. So they think the trade uncertainty has a lot to do with why this is happening. Supply shocks plus weak demand. The Hormuz oil disruptions are adding inflationary pressures, while overall growth remains soft. Trade and policy, you have tariffs have hit export-sensitive sectors in Canada. Both countries face uncertainty. Literally, Trump's tariffs are messing with both countries, causing uncertainty. That's lowering hiring, causing a lot of issues. People can't get jobs, and they can't afford to live. Structural shifts. Canada's slower immigration/population growth reduces labor supply and hiring needs. In both countries, years of oil underinvestment globally contribute to energy volatility, which complicates business. Stagflation echo, higher inflation risk from oil make aggressive rate hikes less likely. The weak hiring adds to family budget stress via slower wage gains and job insecurity, especially at mortgage renewal time in Canada. This isn't a full-blown collapse. Unemployment is still moderate, and some sectors like healthcare, defense, and energy are holding up or growing. But it's clearly a cooling market, making households feel the pinch. All right, let's figure out what this 49 represents.
This is the decisive layer, because higher energy prices do not stay inside the energy sector. They move into trucking, shipping, fertilizer, plastics, food, utilities, airline routes.
Higher energy prices, you will see that everywhere.
Insurance costs, and the psychology of every household that has to fill a tank before they can even think about discretionary spending. That is what makes this moment different from a clean recession call. This is not just a domestic slowdown. It is a domestic slowdown meeting an external price shock. That is the kind of combination that turns weakness into a hemorrhage. And the line at 49 was reached before the full March damage entered the data stream. That is the part people are underestimating. The model is already sitting 1 point below the threshold, while still reading a world that was less damaged than the one we are standing in now. In other words, the 49 is already stale, and stale in the wrong direction. The model is reading yesterday's weakness, while tomorrow's shock is already here. Without the history, 49 is just a dramatic number. With the history, it becomes a warning label. Because the point is not that the model exists. The point is that it has been here before. The last time it reached this kind of level outside a live recession was 2007. Before that, it rose ahead of 2001. Before that, ahead of 1990. Before that, ahead of the early 1980s. Before that, ahead of the oil shock recession in the 1970s. The pattern repeats because recessions do not arrive as surprises to the data. They arrive as surprises to the people who refuse to read the data honestly. That distinction matters. A recession usually feels sudden only to the public. To the ledger, it has been forming for months. Labor weakens first at the margin. Confidence slips next. Growth slows. Markets start repricing. Credit conditions harden. And then one visible shock, an oil spike, a financial failure, a policy error, a war, a demand collapse, takes a body that was already fragile and pushes it over the line. That is why the historical record is so useful. It strips away the fantasy that every downturn is a random event. It is not random. It is cumulative. And this is where the model becomes much more than a US signal, because Canada almost never gets to remain untouched by American recession dynamics.
I mean, what was it? 70% of our trade goes to the US. Our economies are very closely tied. I think that's decreased recently with Trump's tariffs, but like still, the economies and under Kuzma, the amount of integration there is massive. So if you're measuring the US economy, you can usually use that to predict the Canadian economy.
The United States is not just another economy beside Canada. It is the dominant buyer, the dominant financial gravity, the dominant demand partner, and the dominant source of transmitted weakness when things start failing south of the border. So when the American data cluster begins to resemble prior recession clusters, Canadians should not read that as foreign news. They should read it as incoming weather. That is exactly what we opened in the 51st state trap and the passenger seat. Canada likes to describe itself as sovereign in rhetoric while living as a passenger in macro reality. When the driver swerves, the passenger still hits the windshield. That is the historical lesson. The model does not tell you the exact day. It tells you the weather system is already forming. Recessions do not come from nowhere. They come from ignored deterioration. Quick poll in the comments. What matters more right now, the oil shock or the labor slowdown? Now bring it home. If the line crosses 50 and the record holds, the United States enters recession within the next year. That is not an optional event for Canada. The export link is obvious. The capital link is obvious. The currency link is obvious. When American demand weakens, Canadian output follows. When U.S. firms cut orders, Canadian suppliers lose volume. When U.S. markets de-risk, Canadian markets do not remain untouched. And when the U.S. economy contracts into an oil-driven inflation environment, the pressure on Canada is worse because Canada enters the cycle with a more indebted household sector and a more fragile housing structure. That is the real crisis. Canada is not arriving at this possible recession from a position of strength. The Bank of Canada is already holding rates while growth weakens and unemployment rises. The household is already over-leveraged. Mortgage renewals are already rolling in. Youth unemployment is already elevated. Per capita pain is already visible. So if the American economy crosses from slowdown into recession while oil remains elevated, the Canadian household gets hit from 3 directions at once. Income risk from weaker labor, cost pressure from energy and food, debt service pressure from renewals, and a central bank that cannot simply slash rates without importing more inflation through the currency and the fuel channel. That is why a model in Washington matters at a kitchen table in Brampton. The line is American. The bill is Canadian. And unlike the United States, Canada does not even get the comfort of being the reserve currency issuer inside the storm. It drains the household from both sides, importing the weakness and importing the price pressure, while pretending it has a clean, independent response available. It does not. The American recession line is rising, while Canada is already walking into renewal shock and wage weakness. The two systems are chained together. One data update south of the border becomes a household problem north of it. That is not abstract macro. That is a delayed invoice. America prints the signal. Canada receives the invoice.
cascade.
If the line crosses 50 and the recession pattern holds, the sequence is not mysterious. Markets fall first, not all at once, not evenly, but enough to hit confidence and funding conditions. Equities reprice before layoffs become front page truth because markets discount the next stage of weakness before households fully feel it. Hiring freezes second. That is how labor pain enters the system quietly. Firms stop expanding before they start cutting. Young workers and job switchers feel it first, then contractors, then marginal full-time roles. The labor market looks stable on paper, even while the actual opportunity set is shrinking in real time. Consumer spending weakens third. That is the engine room. Households do not need to panic for spending to contract. They just need to get cautious. One fewer dinner out, one delayed appliance purchase, one canceled trip, one decision to hold cash instead of spending it. Across millions of households, that caution becomes output weakness. Credit.
Like, consumer confidence is so important. They'll start restricting what they buy. The as you say, explains the cascade across the whole economy of things tightening.
Tightens fourth. Banks get selective. Refinancing gets harder. Small businesses face tougher terms. Households needing flexibility find less of it available. In Canada, this matters more because credit tightening lands on a population already facing mortgage rollover. The household does not only meet a weaker economy, it meets a weaker economy while its largest monthly liability is being repriced. Then the depletion of fiscal room accelerates, tax revenue softens, deficit pressure rises, political promises get thinner. Rescue becomes more expensive or less willing to finance fantasy at the old price. That is the cascade. And the crucial point is this. The recession does not begin when television declares it. It begins when the sequence starts. By the time the official label arrives, hiring has already slowed, spending has already weakened.
Yeah, by the time they say it's a recession, you've been in a recession.
And households have already started cutting back. That is what makes the 49 so important. It is not a verdict on the future. It is evidence that the sequence may already be underway. The recession starts in behavior before it appears in headlines. Close the folder. There's a line. It sits at 49. It has never crossed 50 without a recession following inside the next 12 months.
I still don't know what the 49 is. We're almost at the end. Is he not going to
That
explain?
reading was taken before the full damage of the oil shock, the confidence collapse, and the newer labor softness had fully entered the model. The next update will see a weaker world than the last one did. And that matters, because the line does not exist in isolation. It sits beside weaker payrolls, weaker sentiment, slower growth, higher oil, falling markets. And central banks that, as we already showed in Owing to Canaan, the stagflation trap, are stuck between inflation they cannot ignore and weakness they cannot cleanly relieve. That is the real message. The model is not magic, it is a mirror. And right now, the mirror is showing an economy that looks increasingly like the economies that eroded before the public noticed. For Canadians, the meaning is even harsher. Because Canada enters this possible recession with less household room, more housing sensitivity, and more dependency on U.S. demand than the public likes to admit, the model is reading American data. But in a branch plant economy tied to the same continental machine, American recession probability is also a measure of Canadian coming pain. That is why this number deserves attention. Not because one model should rule your life, because one model with an 80-year record is now sitting 1 point below its danger threshold, while almost every major input around it is deteriorating. You do not need to worship the model, but you do need to understand what it is saying. It is saying this.
So it's American recession probability.
System is near the line.
That's the number.
It is saying the buffers are thin. It is saying the next shock does not need to be enormous if the body is already this fragile. And for a generation trained to believe the rescue always comes, that is the most dangerous part of the file. The rescue is no longer guaranteed. The line is getting closer, and belief is running into arithmetic again. The line is not the crisis. The line tells you the crisis is close enough to smell. Drop A like so more households see this before the next data update. Subscribe for the economic truths nobody else will say out loud. Tell me in the comments. Are you making decisions right now like a recession is coming? Or are you still betting the system finds a way out? I am Hoch, and I will see you in the next one.
Okay. So first of all, I want to look up that number. American recession probability number. It's taking a long time to think. likely term U.S. recession probability. That I don't know what I'm seeking. I don't think he told me the exact definition. Okay, the current consensus probability of a U.S. recession in the next 12 months, with some prominent models approaching a coin flip level around 49%. This is elevated compared to the typical background risk, not the base case. So only, I mean, with some prominent models. Latest estimates from major sources. Moody's Analytics, 49%. Highest profile figure, one tick below the historical 50 warning threshold that precedes every U.S. recession in the past 80. So this is what he's talking about. Moody's Analytics. It has risen sharply due to the oil shock. Goldman Sachs puts it 30, JP Morgan 35, 40, 27 to 32. Okay. Recession risk is meaningful but far from certain. Most forecasters still expect the U.S. to muddle through with slower but positive growth, aided by eventual rate cuts later in 2026. Okay, so not guaranteed, but the thing is, my opinion, when the economy weakens, you start to see people towards extreme. And I think we see this in politics right now. People are moving out towards the extremes. And I think this is largely because of a weakening economy. And if the economy continues to weaken, the chances of seeing a recession, like up to like 49%, that's a pretty high chance of a recession. Thing is, like, recessions happen throughout all of history. How you get out of the recession is what matters, and usually it leads to like a more dramatic shift in like politics, which we might see. I think you can see this thing happening right now in the UK. Their more extreme right wing and their more extreme left wing parties are currently more popular than the traditional parties, or more middle. I mean, in the end, they hopefully one of those parties as a way to get out of the recession. We've been there before. Be there again. If I remember correctly, usually you have to raise taxes on the rich. Wasn't that how we got out of the Great Recession? I mean, that and a war, hopefully. Ugh. Is that why he's starting a war? Sucks. Well, I mean, nothing's certain yet. If we go into a recession, then we'll look up ways to get out of the recession and push for that in politics. Usually the economy goes through ups and downs, so I mean we'll just have to see. Let's have a look at what people are saying in the comments. You start once again, I'm no economist, but I have been totally unaware. But I have been totally unaware of this indicator. What I am aware of is recession after recession going back to the mid 70s. I also remember being very hungry in the early 80s. There was no government help, no helicopter money, no anything except family, community, etc. What is coming is going to be brutal for those that never knew or have forgotten. So clearly an older watcher. Please talk about the 90 billion train disaster planned that will likely never happen but will make Carney's friends richer. Okay, I'm doing video recommendation. The Canadian government's response is here, have some food stamps. Called something else, but yes, food stamp. Middle class is consuming food stamps now. Socialism is sinking us all into a deep broke hell. I mean, like that's a doomer take. I think we can figure out a way out of this. Dude, we've been in a recession for a long time. We're just about in a depression a couple of years ago. Standards for that are touch replies. I can click down. Printing a few more trains of currency. At least Canadian media is honest about what is happening, so potentially be materially and psychologically prepared. Like, I think our media here is more honest than in the US. I don't think they're that honest. Like, I haven't seen anyone talking about, oh yeah, recession's coming. Be prepared. It's over. Canada's just doing what it's destined for. If Carney had any intentions of looking like he wanted to fix anything, have immediately dropped intra-provincial trade barriers. Wouldn't have saved the situation, but it would have gave an indication, some sort of effort. From what I understand, they're pushing to get inter-trade barriers removed. Um, Canada is not the only one in trouble, but we are in a situation that would take a miracle to turn around. It is literally possible. Way worse than anyone thinks. I'm going to be honest. I think Canada has a lot going for it. Like, I personally think Carney is moving in a lot of the correct directions. Um, he's trying to remove trade barriers. He's investing more into oil and gas and electricity. I don't like the big deficit spending. That concerns me. Hate deficit spending. Then I'm not an economist. Maybe the things he's getting out of it are worth it. I just, as soon as you're over the 70% to GDP ratio, basically have to stop deficit spending. Because deficit spending beyond that starts to severely restrict your economy. And I don't see a solution for that in the short term. But like, we're a massive country. We have huge amounts of natural resources, largely a well-educated population. I think we're a couple good laws away from like a boom in our economy. It would only take a couple change in laws, some removing of regulations and restrictions, leaning a bit more into the free market. And I think we could turn it all around. And like that's what I'll try and do with my vote. Vote for the person who I think will turn the country around. Till then, I'll just talk about it. Always good. I'm not gonna watch this one. Um, I'm gonna start trying to leave it for, ethical reaction, right? Leave it for 4 days.
There's a model.
That
Yep.
way you also get comments that are good. I'm going to post that one too in chat. Where's the third one? Bingo. All right. Got this because I'm going to change what we're talking about. One last thing I want to look at before I get off. I don't remember where in the news I heard about this. Hopefully AI can help me. I heard in the news that there's a happiness index, and when it looks at Canadian youth, the number was quite bad. Could you tell me where this index is? It was a K. So old Canadians feel that the country was like amazing and they rated their happiness in top 5. And young Canadians, it was dismal, like 75th or something. But I mean I don't know if that's real. We're gonna see. Ooh, one query left right before I end. Perfect. Yes, the index you're referring to is the World Happiness Report. This is the. Can I click on this and go to the World Happiness Report? I can look at that. Young, all ages, the rest among the worst places. Canada is among the worst places for young adults. Countries ranked by happiness and age cohort. Okay, countries, the young. So this is the ranking for the young. What age is the young? Best. So Serbia, the young are the happiest. If we go all ages, I think Canada was pretty high up. Maybe not. Mexico. You mean people are happy in Mexico? People are more happy in Mexico than Canada. 25th. 71st. Oh, oh, that is bad. That is bad. Like, what? China? People are not happy in China at all. Really? Ouch. Philippines, Singapore. I thought Singapore was a happier place. I guess 30, 36 on all. Singaporean youth also very, very negative. United Kingdom, Japan, United States, 60. Ooh, where are children happy? Costa Rica, Israel, Serbia, Iceland, Denmark, Kosovo, Finland. Pretty high up there in both of them. I think, what was it? I wanted to look at the Finland housing market at some point. Because they do some kind of social housing really well. or not social housing, just decommodified housing. Let's read what the ChatGPT is saying about this. This is the world's leading annual publication on global well-being, produced by the Wellbeing Research Center at the University of Oxford, in collaboration with Gallup and the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. It ranks countries based on average life satisfaction, 0 to 10. Cantrid ladder score from the Gallup World Poll, asking people to rate their overall life. Canada ranking 26 report. Overall, all ages, Canada ranked 25th out of about 175 countries. Satisfaction score equals about 6.74. This is Canada's lowest ever position, down from 18th in 2025 and top 5/6 a decade ago. That's Trudeau right there. The happiness of our country from 5 or 6, 18th. Still continuing to drop. 25th. Youth under 25 is Canada ranked 71st. Like, in my opinion, don't construct your country, children to live good lives. Won't have a country for very long. The, the youth are going to grow up, and if you haven't made it so that they can live a good life, that's what, the end of your country. You gotta design your country in such a way for the to be able to prosper. And when you're ranked 71st on the global happiness index, you have not done that. That is a failure. Well, I'll have to. One of the plans I have here is that I'm gonna try and go through and like design society how we should run it, just based off my knowledge, and we'll see how that goes. How we can change our democratic system, democracy to better help Canada. Like, we were up at 5 or 6. Now the youth is down to 71. That is a tremendous fall. But hey, I mean, if you can fall, you can climb, right? This is a dramatic drop and one of the sharpest declines worldwide for young people. Only a handful of countries like Malawi, Lebanon, and Afghanistan. I don't know about Malawi, but Lebanon and Afghanistan, didn't they like, wasn't that a war that caused that drop? Young Canadians under 25 or under 30 in some breakdowns have gone from being the happiest age group in Canada around 2011 to the least happy now. Life satisfaction for this group has fallen by roughly 0.86, 1.14 points on the 10-point scale over the past decade, far worse than in most other countries. Ouch. Today's coverage you heard was reacting of these exact youth figures March 2026 release. This ties into some of the economic pressures we've discussed: housing affordability, per capita GDP weakness, job market softness, and mortgage stress, which the report and analysts often link to dissatisfaction. Though the 2026 edition emphasizes social media as a major driver alongside economic factors. Like the past decade, like most of that was Trudeau, right? And the liberals are still in. I like Mark Carney like significantly more than Trudeau. I don't I don't know if he could turn that around. Is Canada doing anything about these dismal numbers for the youth? One more question, then we're done. It's going to cut me off after this. I got the thinking mode on. What else do I got open? This is the Canada's way down here. 24 for the rest, the middle age group. GDP growth, that's something I need. That didn't help. Country list government debt to GDP ratio. Canada? Weren't we like 110? 111. That it continues to go up. I like that image. Save that one. Okay, let's just have a quick read. Yes, Canada is taking some targeted steps on youth well-being and mental health. Though there hasn't, like, in my opinion, the largest part of this is financial strain. Well-being and mental health. I don't know. Maybe I'm weird, but I've never really had issues with mental health. I've always been one of those people that's like you just keep going, right? Well-being and mental health. Though there hasn't been a new federal announcement directly in response to the okay. The Carney government and provinces are building on programs while ramping up debate on social media restrictions, which is the key driver of I don't know social media restrictions. Like that's not going to solve the problem. A UBI or basic income solve the problem. Social media restrictions are not going to solve the problem. Youth Employment and Skills Program, 5 billion specifically. And summer jobs, youth skill strategy. I mean, like, the best thing you could do for youth employment is stop bringing in so many people to work their jobs. Like, that's the best thing you do for them. Have a visa or temporary worker permit. Bring over, there's like 3 million temporary workers here. They weren't here, they have more jobs. Youth employment skill strategies, social media regulations. maybe I just didn't grow up in the social. Just like I've always kept an arm's distance from it. I use it occasionally. I wouldn't say it's had a negative impact on my personal health, mental health, and it's the most active area right now. Maybe for the younger kids, it is like what do you do? Take social media away? Didn't they do that in Australia and they just all found a way around it? I think watching Australia closely on this one. I'm gonna write that down. We're gonna look at Australia. Yeah, social media. We'll look how that's going to see if it's a reasonable model. Like I know they banned a lot of things, and I was looking through it, but one of the things they didn't ban was um, Roblox, and I'm like, it's basically a social media app with game, like Facebook with social media, and then they added games, Roblox games that kind of added the social media element to it. If you leave that, then you're not going to see results. I mean, we'll check. I'll look into that. Not today, but another day. Broader mental health efforts. Again, I think it's primarily economic issues. Like you can be you could have horrible mental health, but if you're financially well off still, kind of doesn't matter. Get help. You can not get help. If you're doing economically fine, I think mental health is less impactful. It's economic factors that make mental health really show up as a problem. Bigger picture and limitation. These moves address root causes or highlighted economic insecurity, housing, jobs, per capita GDP weakness, and digital media. Likes putting in we've discussed. However, critics note some budget cuts to indigenous and urban youth support, no comprehensive national youth happiness strategy. Experts. So it hasn't gotten bad enough for people to take action yet. I mean, how far down the chart do the youth have to fall before we start taking some extreme measures? In Alberta, provincial programs exist but aren't prominently tied to the report. And yeah, the report is on. Well, this is something we'll have to keep looking at. Anyway, I've been on for 2 hours. I think I'm going to get off now. Friday and all that. I don't know if I'll. Oh my gosh, look at that chat. Can you find where we've come? Anyway, I hope you all have a good night. I'll definitely be on Monday. I'll try and get on sometime on the weekend. Maybe I'll just be playing games with friends or something. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, enjoy.